7. The Four Winds. We headed northwest, up towards the shallows of James Bay, where the whales used to migrate before they packed up and headed down to Australia for good. After the Indians left, the industries and businesses in and around their territories closed up too. Small-time fisheries, hunting camps, tourist traps. After that, the big ones started to fall, large-scale resorts, fly-in luxury cottages, and wilderness getaways for stressed businessmen and their foreign investors. In light of the wars and the rush to adapt and survive, no one really gave a shit about tourism, gross domestic product, or low-level jobs for rurally located folks, though they cared enough to kick everyone out when the former employees tried to bunk down in the once plush rooms and make use of the supplies and heat. They fenced them off, boarded them up, and some even hired security firms to walk around the perimeter and make sure no one was looking to survive on corporate-sponsored vacancy. And this is where we were now, up against the high fence surrounding the Four Winds Resort, according to the faux marble sign at the end of the weed-cracked driveway on the other side. 10, maybe 12 feet. She-Boy was eyeing the top of the fence, razor wire edging, electric charge mechanism. I doubt they're still electrified. That would mean the generator still worked. Mig sounded more hopeful than he looked. Only one way to find out, I suppose. Mig put his pack sack on the ground, pulled off the sash from his forehead, and let his bedroll drop behind his feet. He spit into his palms and rubbed them together. Okay. He took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. I saw what he meant to do when he nudged his bedroll out of the way and took a few steps back, shaking out his arms and rolling his head on the stem of his neck. Shit, Rose hissed like a recoiling snake, her hand reaching over to cover Riri's eyes in anticipation of Meg dancing on an electric jig, sizzling like a frying piece of meat. I saw it in She-Boy's face, the way he suddenly looked young. I saw it in Minerva's eyes before they snapped shut behind wrinkles like clenched fat fists. I felt it in my own pulse. Mig was too important to lose. We couldn't manage without him, and yet here he was, about to take a run at a potentially electrified fence so that we could be sheltered and fed for another night. I locked my eyes on Rose, on that bowed cord of vein and muscles that curved from her earlobe down her neck to the collarbone, and took a step to the right and forward. Before Mig could start his run, before I could lose my nerve, I reached out and took 2 chain links in my fingers. I felt the electricity enter my hand, shoot at my arm, and land like a ball of hornets in my aorta. I swear I did. But it was just adrenaline, because there were no sparks, no smell of barbecued pork, no blindness. There was just that stream of breath and blood and tension rolling from Rose's ear down under the collar of her faded parka. We're good. I wanted it to sound more confident, bigger, with a more nonchalant swagger. Instead, it sounded like the squeak of a 16-year-old boy who had to check with the back of his left hand that he hadn't just wet himself. I released the links and pushed my shaking hand through my hair to give it somewhere to hide. She-Boy slapped me on the shoulder before he leapt onto the fence with a pendulum blanket thrown across the back of his neck like a towel. He clambered to the top. Minerva clapped and smiled, watching him go like a tall Cree monkey, the stress smoothed away from her opened eyes. She-Boy tossed the pendleton over the razor wire at the top and scrambled over. He walked his way down about 8 feet, and then he dropped the rest of the way, just the smothered crunch of gravel to mark his arrival. Wob herded the group over to the huge front gates. There, they waited as She-Boy carefully snapped the glass window from the guard booth and slid out of its frame. He slipped his long body through the square hole to search out a key or some kind of mechanism that would allow the others in without having to climb. No one here is more important than anyone else, French. It was Meg, standing a few steps back. No one should be sacrificed for anyone else. I tried to laugh it off, shrugging and starting a stream of no big deal sentiments, but he refused to allow it. I'm not joking, boy. He held my gaze until the smile disappeared from my face and my cheeks began to burn. Only then did he bend to gather up his things and walk over to the rest of the group by the front gates. If they had heard, no one let on. I was busy feeling sorry for my unappreciated heroics and myself in general, and didn't see Rose there until she briefly took my hand. There was that electricity again, except this time the hornets had bilious wings, and because they swarmed, with texture and speed, from my heart down to my groin. She pressed the pad of her thumb into the shaking center of my hand, then let it go and walked away. That was all. The smile returned, slightly, in the wake of Meg's reproach. The gates popped open with a metallic screech, and we slipped through the small gap rust and atrophy would allow. She-Boy waited for me to step through last, and then locked the gates back up by hand. Then he slid by me in the shadows and made his way to the front, but off to the side so he could scout. I finally looked up when we turned the bend in the driveway and caught my breath. I'd spent most of my early life in the crumbling east of the city, surrounded by urban decay and concrete waste where the skyline looked like a ruined mouth of rotted teeth. That is, except for these last few years out in the bush, where we ran and home was a campfire in a canvas tent. Not that it was bad, it's just that neither extreme had prepared me for the Four Winds resort. From the outside, it looked like an oversized cottage, all wood and peaks and log pillars holding up odd angles and juts. It rose 3 stories, with a front entranceway that stretched out the front as a long corridor. We made our way to the doors and waited while Chiboy snapped the locks off with the cutters he kept in his roll. Then, Tree and Ziguan pried off the boards and opened the old doors with much effort and squealing of joints. Meg watched the darkness beyond the gates nervously. The moon lit the wide front hall in pale ribbons, turning the dust and broken bits of chair and wainscoting and climbing vines from feral houseplants into fairy tale turrets. We walked slowly, out of habit, out of fear, but also, now, out of reverence. This space felt untouched. We could feel the thrum of old activity sliding along the floorboards, caught in the keyholes of closed doors. Everything had been shut tight while so much was still supposed to happen. The intent and plans hadn't had time to vacate. And here we were now, opening the lid of a sealed jar. All the anticipation of tomorrow planned 1,000 yesterdays ago came scattering to our feet like slick-shelled beetles. The lower windows were all boarded up on either side of the hallway, done professionally, with sheets of reinforced plywood, backed with crossed 2x4s. But the skylight arching out over the hallways above us showed us the night through glass opaque with greasy animal prints, bird shit, and weather. Still, there were stars, and we passed down the hall 2x2, like visiting dignitaries underneath them. At the end of the hallway was a dark hole. The glass ceiling and boarded-up walls ended, and whatever lay ahead was covered in silence and blackness. We gathered at the dark opening, waiting to know what to do. Once our eyes adjusted, we could make out lighter rectangles of gray on the far extremes of the space. That's where Meg and Chiboy went, to the lighter patches in the unknown. I kept my eyes to the right and saw Meg's hands suddenly dark on the gray. He pulled back what I understood then to be drapes, and swatches of sky diluted this dark with the soft moonlight. He passed by a stone mantel set in the wall and repeated the same on the other side. Across the room, Chiboy also found floor-length windows on either side of a stone-mantled fireplace. We took in the room, quickly at first to scan for danger, and then, with more care, to see everything we could in this space that was not forest or dilapidated barn. Think the fireplaces still work? Wow was almost happy, which was a strange tone coming from her serious face. Meg shook his head. Doesn't matter, we can't use them. Fire comes with smoke, and this isn't a low campfire. Those chimneys would push smoke up past the tree line pretty damn quick. The curves of her shoulders slumped, but she said nothing in return. But we can light up all these candles here. He touched a cream-colored pillar near the circumference of Riri on the mantel. There were more alongside it of various heights and widths. There were even more on the low, round table in front of the fireplace. What are these? It was Sloffer. He ran his hands along a sheet-covered lump. There were 2 of them, one on either side of the table. Here. Chiboy yanked the edge of a sheet, and a long, sage-hued sofa appeared. Slopper looked skeptical until Chiboy sat on it, testing the springs by bouncing a bit, then lay down with an exaggerated sigh, folding his hands behind his head. Slopper ran around the table and pulled the sheet off the second one, getting tangled pretty good in voluminous folds and coughing from dust. With Riri's help, he was freed, and the pair bounced and giggled on the sofa's match set. Meg and Wob were lighting candles, and the room became lighter and smaller, the space more defined. After so much time in the wide open, I was pleased to be contained. I sat on the edge of a couch and watched this new place illuminate. The walls were cedar, and the floors covered with carpet in a pattern of autumn leaves caught in a circular wind. Behind us, to the left of the entrance from the glass hallway, was a computer. There was an open space behind it, and a wooden plaque hanging on the back wall with the letters burned into it. Front desk. I walked over and around the counter and slid in behind. There was a telephone on the wall, the old kind with a curly cord attached. I picked it up, and its weight shocked me. I couldn't put it to my ear, the motion too foreign, so I placed it gently back in its metal cradle. A stack of impossibly thick yellow books, the edges curling up like fiddleheads, were piled on the floor, leaning up against the wall. I crouched behind the counter and inspected the half wall of cubbyholes. In one was a shallow box of pens monogrammed with the same logo we'd seen on the sign outside the building. In another was a collection of little chips and fasteners of various sizes. In half a dozen other were papers, some written on, others sealed, some with line after line of careful script crossed out with thick colored lines. In a bottom hole was a 6-pack of bottled water. I grabbed that and slid it above me onto the counter. Woohoo! Water! I heard stomping as Riri and Slopper bounced over to retrieve the precious find. Then, the reproach of the others, warning them not to open it yet, to wait, to ration. I laughed to myself, imagining Slopper's cheeks hanging in disappointment. Beside the cubbies was a very long, very narrow drawer, as tall as the counter it was set into and only wide enough to accommodate a coin-sized handle. What's this? I gave it a good yank, anticipating the resistance of time and atrophy, so that when it slid easily open, I fell on my ass, knob still in hand. There was the clatter of metal on metal. Mig came forward, bending on a knee. Keys. He reached up the numbered plates, then looked to the stairs curved to the second floor from either side of the great room. Room keys. We shuffled up the stairs, kicking balls of dust and busted plaster as we went. As was custom, Meg and She-Boy took up the vulnerable front and back positions. Everyone but Minerva held a candle. I stood as tall as I could behind Meg, peering over his shoulder ahead and down over the railing to the great room, lit on the far side by the remaining candles. I tried to open my eyes as far as I could to be as useful as possible. I was focused, but not so much that I couldn't feel Rose reaching for my elbow when we got to the top. Wob carried the keys in the cradle she'd made out of the front of her sweater, and they slid against each other like low metallic groans. We turned toward the dark in front and illuminated a flickering tunnel of doors. Each one was labeled with a small plaque inscribed with a number. Wob walked the line and handed a key to each person. Mig nodded, and She-Boy went to the first door on the right side of the hall with the matched key. He put it into the lock, filled his lungs with air so his shoulders rose halfway to his ears, and pushed. The suck of air was audible and popped low in my eardrum like a lid being lifted. And when She-Boy disappeared into the room, I panicked a bit and crossed the hall to take up the space he'd left in the doorway. She-Boy walked the perimeter of the room before setting the candle down on a small round table in front of another empty fireplace, on a much smaller scale than those in the great room. He moved to the bed against the wall and slowly folded his length on top of the comforter. It was big enough for 6 pillows, side by side, stacked 3 deep. He adjusted the pillows under his head and nuzzled into the skin of the made bed like a child. It made me smile, seeing She-Boy, the fierce scout, bending his arms under his head, wiggling his ass to get into the softness with a goofy grin on his face. I ran back out into the hallway and lay down to the door with my number on it. The lock was stiff, and I turned it twice before it gave and the door swung in. Riri was behind me, holding her candle at my elbow. I could feel the pinch of its heat. She gasped into the space, a whole, empty, contained space, and followed me in. I threw open the curtains covering the windows on the far wall and illuminated the carpet on the floor. It was a mass of vines and blooms that twisted sinisterly in the flame, but sat, docile and domestic, in the moonlight. This place is huge, she said. I know. Who needs this much space? She asked. Not sure. I pulled off my torn boots with the toe of the other stepping on the heel. It felt wrong to tromp around in outside shoes. You didn't check for snakes first, Frenchie. She was upset. Sorry, Ree. I took the candle from her and walked the perimeter of the room, holding it under the small table and dropping to my knees to check under the bed. The corners were choked with dust and smelled like a whole metropolis of mice had lived and bred there, probably until the cats got wise and moved in before moving on, but no snakes. All clear, no snakes, just some regular old monsters under the bed. That's it. Really? Rose answered from just inside the door. I knew we should have stopped to grab holy water for the buggers on the way in here. I smiled. I couldn't help the size of it either. She made me look stupid when she was around. Come on, Rose, let's go into your room next. Riri grabbed her by the forearm and spun her out of the room, making Rose's long, dark hair fan out and settle across her shoulders like a shawl. We each checked into a room and made ourselves comfortable, and then trudged back down the stairs to grab our gear and bring it up to the other candles. There was no use of risking theft or discovery because of a few pinpoints of light reflected in an abandoned window. It was strange, all of us separated by walls, divided into compartments like bees in a dusty hive, so we kept our doors open. I could hear Riri laughing and the rhythmic thump of bed springs as someone jumped. She and Slopper ran up and down the hall a few times before Slopper, wheezing and holding his rounded side, huffed, All right, enough, geez, let's lay down a bit.